my life began growing up in South Africa, deep in the middle of apartheid. And my first love was theoretical physics. So studied theoretical physics in South Africa, and then moved from South Africa to Germany, did my PhD there, worked as a researcher in physics then in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And that was the point where I decided, number one, I'm at heart an inventor. I'm a connector of things. And to get a permanent position in physics, I need to become so narrowly specialized that nobody else really understands what I'm talking about. That wasn't for me. Offered a job with Procter & Gamble, and so changed completely to industry, worked as an R&D manager then for Procter & Gamble in Belgium and China. And I was in China from the early to the late 2000s. The SARS coronavirus one, I was in Beijing when they went from denial to lockdown in a 1-week period. And then a few weeks later, took less than a week to build a 400-bed hospital. In China, pollution in Beijing, 2005, oil price hit $150 a barrel. And all of this brought back to mind for me what I'd experienced when reading and encountering limits to growth and the whole climate change question when I was an early physics student. And it suddenly struck me, this is happening now, not in 10, 20, 30 years after I'm dead. And so I thought, no, I'd better do something about this. And did what I could inside Procter & Gamble, and was simply unable to really get anything moving inside P&G. So took the very difficult decision to leave Procter & Gamble in 2007. And as I put it now, decided that I had to find an answer to a central question. We have a dysfunctional global system, and yet everything that's been attempted so far to turn it around has failed to turn it around. At best, things like triple bottom line, conscious capitalism, corporate social responsibility, fair trade, whatever you look at best, they've slowed things down. Nothing has succeeded in turning it around. And as I put it now, I was asking myself the question, we have this beautifully stable system that we can't change, and it's dysfunctional. What's the anchor holding our dysfunctional system stable in its dysfunctionality? Because it was clear to me that until we find that anchor and lift it, we're simply not going to succeed no matter what else we try. So left Procter & Gamble, which was kind of tough. 2008, I simultaneously encountered two important things. One of them was CDF, Otto's work through the programs that Rainer was running in Brussels. And I was enormously inspired by just how everything fitted together. It was a complete system within the arena that it was operating in. And at about the same time, I encountered holacracy from Brian Robertson. Started using holacracy in the initiative we were running back then called Renaissance 2, which is about bringing together a small ecosystem of what the future might look like and into dialogue. And trying to use holacracy internally didn't work. It blew up in our faces. And it struck me, I know why this is blowing up. It's because of the egos of us as we engage with each other. We need to bring Otto's work and integrate it with holacracy to make something that is whole and will work. And so I worked on that for a couple of years, and this was looking good, this integration. And then for the startup I was spending a lot of my time in, we needed to bring in some investment. And it struck me, oh no, as we bring in investment, we're a for-purpose, values-driven organization. We want to stay true to our essence forever. As we bring in investment, all kinds of stuff is going to be at risk. And that's where I started to get somewhat of an understanding of just what are the anchors that are holding our dysfunctional system in place. Now, everything I'm about to say is written up in this book over here, which is available pretty much anywhere in the world. The other thing I'm going to say is, if you don't have me on speaker view, please put me onto speaker view or pin me onto the screen. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be able to read what is on my background. So, okay, you've spotlighted me. That works as well. Good, good. So what we came to is to create something that is whole at the level of our global economy. We need to create something that is whole across all 5 of these strata. And it struck me that this is what is missing in many of the very necessary initiatives to make the world a better place. One or more of these strata is not touched. It's left the way it was. And that's where the anchors are. And let me just jump to here. The question I'm going to suggest we discuss once I finish talking. Hang on, why is that one in there? That is the wrong question. Why? I do apologize. Right. Okay, we'll come back to there when we get there. Right. So the question that I'm going to propose, and I'll speak it rather than leave it to be read, is in your work in the world, whether you're working in a company, consulting to clients or whatever, let's explore when we get to that conversation, which of these strata are you working in, and what are the effects on your work of the other strata? How does that shape the outcomes you're getting, and what might be necessary to do in strata you're currently not touching to get the outcomes you need? So now I'm going to dive in a bit deeper and draw some connections with the dialectic thought forms. And as I said to Bernard earlier, I've probably got about 3 to 4 hours of material here. So Bernard, if you could give me some guidance on time flow so that we get to bed before midnight for those of us who are in that kind of time zone.
Half an hour would be good.
Perfect. So that gives you an idea of, the reason why I'm doing all of this is really, how can we build a global economy that works by building up through the strata? And we're in the middle of now the early waves of total system collapse. And so we have to do something that is radical, that can work, and is probably impossible to be too radical in what we need to do now. So to dive in now, Otto pointed out to me a few months ago that what these layers are developing is actually a sociology of ecosystems. Each stratum itself is itself an ecosystem. They're a nested ecosystem, or a nested set of ecosystems. And that perhaps points at some of the first thought forms to dive into here. So yeah, with the sociology of ecosystems, probably all of you recognize the relevance of thought form 8, the first context thought form. These are all parts within a whole. And within each of these, you find parts within a whole. Now, one of the things that is then also part of my original question, this is a whole that is in equilibrium. The global economy, even the 2008 crisis, didn't really change anything. So we have a whole that's in equilibrium. And then the question comes, what is the anchor holding that whole stable in its equilibrium? This is where with hindsight, I realized as I was going through this, just how much the thought forms have been critical for me to develop what we have developed. The third context thought form, number 10, is looking at the structures and the layers and the functionality of each layer. So in here, the 6 strata that we're working with, stratum 1 is each individual's internal ecosystem, my ecosystem of different identities, different voices, everything that makes me up internally. And there are a lot of people who are doing superb work just in this stratum, say working with leaders, really developing their capacity. The next stratum up is how we interact with each other as human beings. And immediately in here, thought forms come in from the relationship thought form. The interaction between two people often predates those two people. It constitutes their relationship. And some of that might come from the third stratum. They're not just two human beings, they're also representing two roles. And so their human relationship between each other at stratum 2 is shaped by the organization design, the structural relationship between the roles that they are energizing or inhabiting. So all of that is part of it. If we come to stratum 4, that's the stratum where the company is incorporated. So what we're talking about there is the ecosystem of stakeholders and the capitals they represent, the different companies, the systems and interactions between companies. All of that lies in stratum 4. Stratum 5 is then local business ecosystems, and stratum 6 is the global economy, global business ecosystems. So you see in that the fourth context thought form, or thought form 11, there's a natural hierarchy at play here. Now, what's fascinating for me, that there is not just one single hierarchy that's right. You can flip it around. You can also say that at the top of the hierarchy ought to be each individual human being, because that's really what the global economy should be serving. So you've got a multiplicity of potential hierarchies here, all of which points at frames of reference. Whenever you're seeing something as a hierarchy, you have some frame of reference that you're comparing it with, which may or may not be relevant for what you're trying to decide. And this is one of the big issues in organizations, and the whole things like requisite organization design come into that. What's the frame of reference you're using to define a hierarchy in an organization? Is it a management accountability hierarchy? Is it a human capability hierarchy? Do you have a frame of reference that says all hierarchies are bad and you try to eliminate them all regardless? All of that kicks in there. And that for me was a very, very important one. And perhaps out of all of the thought forms, frames of reference is one of my favorite, because I'm so often in conversations with people who are evaluating things. For example, I've talked to people who say all for-profit business is bad, all capitalism is bad. And by exploring behind what they're saying, what's the frame of reference that they're using, I can find ways to engage them in a dialogue to point out that, well, perhaps what we need to do is integrate the healthy aspects of for-profit with the healthy aspects of not-for-profit to transcend and include. So that's part of what this whole structure gives us. Thought form, the fifth context thought form, number 12, stability of a system. Each of these strata has an anchor. And for me, that was one of the key insights into why we've so far failed to turn the ship around. We need to pull up all of the anchors in all 5 strata before we're going to turn anything around in stratum 6. It's not enough to pull up an anchor in 1 or 2 of the strata. We need to do all of them. So where does that then get me to? Well, one of the things I'll touch on briefly is the 7th context thought for multiplicity of contexts. Hopefully you're seeing in what I'm showing you here the relevance of looking at what we're trying to do through a multiplicity of contexts. Each one of these strata, I often think of as a lens to look at things through. We're not saying that this is right for some definition of right. What we're saying is that this is a useful lens to look at what we're doing in business, in the economy through. It highlights some things, it hides other things, and it's the wise way of going at it is to be aware of what will each lens that you're using highlight, what will it hide, and to just check, am I highlighting the things that are important to see and hiding the things that are irrelevant, rather than the other way around, which is well known to be unhelpful. So that gives you an intro into here. Bernard, process check. Roughly how much time do I have left?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Perfect. Perfect. Right. So then let me dive into a couple of the process thought forms. So what we've already touched on in here is each of these is this is a set of lenses. Nothing is right or wrong necessarily in what I'm saying. More is a question of, is it useful or not useful for what you're trying to understand? And that, for me, is one of my other favorite thought forms. Knowledge is always under construction. Yeah. And constructing knowledge, for me, one of the most powerful elements of that is the choice of lenses that I'm using to look at something through. We can never take in everything that there is. We're always using lenses to shut down 99% of everything that we could take in, to reduce it to something that is manageable. And it's vitally important to be really conscious of what is it that we're not taking in as we do that work. And I know, Emily, you're deep into warm data, and I think that's a superb example of raising awareness of other lenses that we could use to look at things through, to get a better understanding of what on earth we're dealing with. A few other thought forms here. One of the key things, each of these strata has huge inherent unknowability. It's a bit like Taoism. There's the knowable Tao and the unknowable Tao. In each of these systems, we have a lot that is unknowable. And part of the reason why it's unknowable is because in every single stratum, everything is in constant movement. You know, it's perfectly clear to everybody around the inner world side. But even at the level of incorporation, stratum 4 and stratum 5, business ecosystems, everything is in constant moving in business. You don't know, if you're the CEO of a company, is your majority shareholder going to drop dead tomorrow and somebody else is going to inherit their shares whose only interest is asset stripping your company? You might have a perfectly stable company and you've built up this wonderful culture, everything is working perfectly, and your key investor sells their shares on Friday afternoon to a private equity company. And on Monday morning, they march in and immediately install a completely new leadership team, rip out your entire cultural processes, everything else, and put in an exploitative, extractive system. Yet everything is constantly in motion. So I will move on from there. Just I'll say briefly, I can go through here all of the process thought forms. And as I was preparing this, I was recognizing how all of the process thought forms are very deeply embedded in everything that we're doing here. What I'm going to spend a bit more time on are the relationship thought forms. You know, part of what was very much apparent 10 years ago, limits of separation, the value of bringing into relationship, and critique of neglecting relationship, the first 3 relationship thought forms. Now, I'm going to go back a step. How did I come up with our approach to incorporating companies here, which is, sometimes I call it the free company, other times I call it the Fair Shares Commons company. And I also call it a level 5 company. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So it struck me between 10 and 8 years ago, I had 2 big insights. Coming back to what I said, where we wanted to bring investment into the company, the startup that we were building then, and realized that as soon as we bring in an investor, we're at risk of losing the essence of the company. It brings in a fragility, a fracture point. And it struck me, first of all, it struck me, oh, wait a minute. If I sell a company, what am I really selling? In particular for this company, which was a knowledge economy company, what I'm selling is human capital. I'm selling the people inside the company. I'm selling their knowledge. I'm selling their relationships. I'm selling the relationships with our customers, our supporters, all of these things. So actually, selling a company is the same as selling people. And selling people is called slavery. And slavery is illegal in almost all countries. You know, the definition of slavery is applying any or all of the concepts of property to a person. And if you read legal texts and financial texts, they often refer to a person meaning both human and non-human persons. Companies are legally persons, very much the same as you or me. And it really struck me that this is one of the key anchors and why we have to do something radically different in Stratum 4. If we treat companies as persons, then we cannot apply any of the concepts of property to a company. And the real issue is that we've structured companies in a way that is schizophrenic. When it benefits the investors, the company is a separate person from the investor, and the investor carries no consequences. And when it benefits the investor to treat the company as property, we treat the company as property. And so it struck me right. We need to emancipate the company. We need to fundamentally change the relationship between the company and the capitals. We need to separate the hardwired relationship we've built in between the past, what was invested in the company in the past, the wealth generated, the right to share the wealth generated, must be separated from the future rather than being in a hardwired relationship where the future is about governance, steering the company wisely into the future. So it struck me right. We have to separate that. We have to truly treat the company as a free individual. And then the next big insight, which came very much at more or less the same time, it struck me, hang on, my background is particle physics. Particle physics, you may be seeing this in these layers. Particle physics says we understand the individual particles and how they interact when we're just dealing with two particles interacting with each other. But as soon as we get to lots and lots of particles, we move to thermodynamics, gravity, whatever, and it's numerically far too demanding for any human being or any of us on the planet to do a first principles calculation from the fundamental particles all the way up to, let's say, the thermodynamics of the Earth's climate. It's just too much. But what we do know is that the thermodynamics of the whole Earth are crucially dependent on the properties of individual water molecules and how they interact with each other. If we change microscopically the properties of water, we can completely change the freezing point of water, which will change the oceans on the Earth either to white solid ice or completely liquid gas. It doesn't take much of a change to the properties of water to do that. So it struck me, what's in here is very much, rather than trying to work through legislation at a national level or a global level to put pressure onto the economy, if we change the properties of companies, the shares and how the representatives interact, the relationship between the company and the stakeholders, change how companies are designed, change how humans interact, and change how each of us interacts with ourselves, we may not need to change very much to make a radical shift in our global economy and do it quickly. So that comes to relationships, the third relationship thought form, DTF 17, critique of neglecting relationships. And it struck me one day, and I still remember the shivers going down my spine, where I suddenly went, aha. It struck me, the very essence of apartheid is a neglect of relationships. In apartheid South Africa, if you were lucky enough to be born with a white skin, all of the voting rights were allocated to people with white skins. And that brought with it the power to decide what to do with the company in the future, what to do with the country in the future, and who got how much of the wealth generated through what was happening in the country. And it struck me, in business, we have a parallel. If you're lucky enough to have money to invest in a company, you get all of the voting rights in the general meetings. You have all of the power to decide on the future of the company and on how the wealth generated is distributed. And it struck me that the way we incorporate companies today is both has parallels to slavery and it has parallels to apartheid. And that if we incorporate in a way that actively includes all of the relationships that are implicitly there, build companies so that all of the capitals that the company depends on is included, all of the stakeholders that represent those capitals are included, they are brought into a concrete relationship. It brings into relationship the fourth relationship thought form. All of the different frames of reference are now consciously in the company. It brings in also a formal structuring of relationship that is now inclusive rather than exclusive. That's what our current limited company is. It's a formal structuring of relationships between capitals and their stakeholders and other companies in a way that is exclusive, that is separating rather than connecting. By the way, for those who don't speak Dutch or Afrikaans, the word apartheid has two parts. Height just means a situation or context of, and apart means apart. So apartheid really is pointing at a neglection of relationships. It's keeping things separate that are actually connected. Relationship 6, relationship 7 are all then inside this as well. You know, we have patterns of interactions in companies, and we might go in and work on the culture to change the patterns of interaction there. But if we don't simultaneously change the patterns of interaction from how the roles and tasks are in relationship to each other, we put in a fracture point that will harm that. There are patterns of interaction that are embedded in how we incorporate companies. And if we don't change those patterns of interactions to ones that are supportive of stratum 3, 2, and 1, again, we run into problems. So all of that is in there. And as I said earlier, constitutive relationships are in that as well. Now, I'm going to dive in now and touch on some transformation thought forms. Bernard, how am I doing for time?
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Phew. Right. I do realize that I'm packing a lot of stuff in here, but we've got good time to discuss later. The transformation thought forms are where the rubber really hits the road. Everything that I'm doing is about how do we transform level 5, local business ecosystems, let's say circular economies. How do we build a viable circular economy? Not a fragile one like circular economies are today, but an anti-fragile one. By the way, circular economies today are fragile because stratum 4 breaks trust. You can't have trust over a 50 to 100-year cycle of a circle if any of those companies can be sold, shut down, or exited by the dominant investor in that company, regardless of the impact on the rest of the circle. You have to have a fair shares commons level 5 incorporation, which is one where each company exchanges voting rights and wealth share rights with the other companies that they're interacting with, so that the actual relationship between the companies is effectively reflected in the structural relationship of how they're incorporated. What that then leads to is something that gets quite powerful. So what all of these, everything I'm talking about here now is touching on the transformational thought forms. What we have today is something that we've invented. It's already unstable. It's beyond its limits of stability because we've completely overshot the fundamental paradigm that today's global systems are built on, which is a paradigm where the earth is empty and where where human beings are, let's say, cheap and plentiful. We're now in a paradigm where the earth is full. We have resource scarcity and we have abundance of creativity. So we're already unstable. That means if we get something that really works better, we can use that instability to tip fast into a completely new whole system that works well. And so a lot of what I'm doing is really all of the transformational thought forms. In particular, if we compare systems in transformation, that's where some of the really important work is going on. For example, as I'm engaging with what we're doing, one of the questions I'm often asking is, what is the impact of freedom? Where is freedom occurring in one system or another? And what is the consequence of that? Again, you see that in what I was saying about the fair shares commons incorporation as something that is a commons. It's fundamentally free. Part of the consequences of a fair shares commons incorporation is that all decisions have to take into account the needs of the next 7 generations, not just today's generation. And as a commons, it's not property that is owned to be bought or sold. It's a commons of productive capacity to be stewarded wisely for the benefit of all of the stakeholders, from small to large, across all sectors. It's not just there to be good, it's not just there to be bad. One thing I want to put in, by the way, in terms of when I talk about building a system that works or building a whole system, one of the discussions I often have, some people say to me, well, this will get rid of something. And I often say, no, it won't. We need that. We need the parasites. We need the predators. That's all part of a system that works. You can't get rid of one without losing the other. And that's really something I can spend hours talking about. But what I do want to touch on is thought form 26, the 5th transformation thought form, bringing multiple systems into balance. It's critical, this understanding, to bring multiple systems into balance, this recognition that very often what we're dealing with are complementary pairs, like a yin-yang or particles, waves in physics. You cannot reduce one without simultaneously changing the other. And they actually come together as one conjugate pair, not as separate elements. So to bring multiple systems into balance, the for-profit industrial complex has a lot of negatives. The non-profit industrial complex also has a lot of negatives. Each of them supports the other. So if we're going to create a new system that works, we need to find a way of bringing together into a completely new balance the for-profit and the non-profit industrial systems in a way that transcends and includes. And then I'm going to jump forwards. So I've touched a bit on integrating multiple perspectives in what I've been saying. As part of thought form 28, transformation 7 is in there. Open systems in constant transformation. Again, if you think of these 6 strata, each of these is an open system in constant transformation. They also interact up and down. There's power inside here. All kinds of things are happening in here. And I think I'm running close to the end of time. So I'm going to come to one more thing, and then I'm going to stop talking. So just briefly, you've probably, all of you have seen these two axes, the human axis and the organizational axis, the SDO plot. What we're adding in also is the vertical axis of how it's incorporated. That's kind of important because the value of stability to move along for the task and the human, if it's a standard limited company, that value of stability ends just before level 2, psychological safety. Psychological safety is fragile and crucially dependent on the benevolent dictatorship of the owners in a standard limited company. Whereas the fair shares commons, that's where the value of stability extends pretty much the whole range. It's not so stable down here because it creates a lot of appetite in people to move up to the higher levels of autopoietic organizations and where development is a core purpose. So that's then where I'm going to stop as sort of an attempt in showing you that, of bringing it back to a point of showing where we can go into in the discussion of how are these strata shaping what you're doing, and where in particular is there something that is not visible in the change programs you're working on, but that might be shaping or even controlling what is happening. And one of my favorite questions there is, what is it that I don't know that I don't know, where if I knew it, it would change everything? Thank you.